Well, thanks for having me, Mike. This is my second Mountain Ruby talk, and always a good time being here in Salt Lake. It reminds me a lot of Boulder, except the mountains are on the east side, not the west side of town. So as Mike said, title of the talk, Better Ruby Through Design Principles. I got the title of the talk from a Moby album, Better Living Through Chemistry, so hopefully it'll be just as good as the album. My name is Mike Gehard. There's the GitHub. The talk and all the code will be up on GitHub afterwards. Actually, it's up there now, if you want to go look at it. I'm the tech lead for user acquisition in the Boulder Living Social office, so it's kind of back-to-back Living Social. And as some people can attest to, I like old things. So I have Buddhist symbols tattooed on the inside of my forearms. I talk about yogic scripture. Hundreds of years, probably, thousands of years ago, this guy came up with a quote that says, "Nothing endures but change." How many people agree with that?
Is that still true?
That nothing endures but change? I don't know. We'll find out. That'll change too, maybe. So that's great. Old guys, dead Greeks. How does that apply to Ruby? How many people sit around and ask themselves this question? Like, hey, is my app going to change at some point in my career? Like, how many people ask themselves that question? Really? Isn't that a constant? That probably doesn't change a whole lot. What you should be asking yourself is, how is my application going to adjust to change? So Gary has kind of started this discussion. We have these apps, not to name names, but a company that I am familiar with has an application that probably needs to change. I know other apps that probably need to change. So really the question is, how are apps going to adjust to change? Are they going to be rigid? Are they going to be hard to change? Is it going to take us 6 weeks to make a change that probably should take a week and a half? I've had that happen. So it's like the Jenga thing. Are you going to pull one of those blocks out and suddenly the test suite explodes if you've got a test suite? Or you push to production and production explodes. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Or is it going to be like this church that I saw in Croatia where, this thing's been up for hundreds of years, it gets a little dirty, they knock some of the dirt off, the church doesn't fall down. That's how we want our apps to react to change. We make a couple of small changes. Yeah, we need to put some scaffolding up around the place where we're making the change, but the tower doesn't fall over when I go to make that change. So anybody any ideas of what determines how our apps relate to change? Anybody? Bueller? Anybody? Yeah, so it's dependencies. It's really the design of the application. So, do you have these walls? So when you build stuff in Boulder, you have to float the walls because the soil is not really all that good. So you float the walls so that when the house shifts, the walls don't fall down. That's a design choice that was made by the architects. I have a friend who's building a house in Boulder. They drove 20-foot pilings down to the bedrock because the soil around the house is so bad, they put the foundation up. So they made choices. They understand kind of what's going to happen to these houses in Boulder when the soil shifts, so they make design decisions. So it's the interactions between classes, which are dependencies. So how do we talk? And I think Gary started this discussion of, how do we get things to talk to other things? Tony's talking about message passing and celluloid. So we're starting to have these discussions. Most of us are Rails programmers. I came to Ruby through Rails, and I'm using Ruby. And I don't need to do design. Really? I get models, I get controllers, I get views. Anybody ever seen that? So I have some alerts. I've got 100 lines of code. Who knows what that does? I've got some stuff going on. The whole fat model movement. Yeah, now we got these obese models that literally can't get themselves through doors. And when you want to change that thing, you're like, whoa, hopefully I don't pull that Jenga cube out and, everything comes to pieces. So much that somebody wrote a book on that. If you haven't picked up, spend the $5. Seriously. Avdi has not paid me to say that. Spend the $5. So we have these things popping up. Gary's whole talk is about how we can start to make our systems a little bit better and more resilient to change. And you're like, oh, design, that's scary. I got UML diagrams and all that fun stuff. I'm not talking about huge upfront design. What I am talking about is taking some time to figure out where we sit on this curve. So Martin Fowler came up with this curve where if I start out over here and my startup's going to fail before it hits here, I don't need to do design. How many people sit around and go, yeah, my startup's going to fail before I need to do design? Let's hope not. So the blue curve represents, this is what happens when I do no design. So I get a huge bump in productivity, I get stuff done fast, and at some point I reach a point of diminishing returns. So this is the change should take me a week, it actually takes me 6 weeks. We hit that inflection point. But if I start to do a little bit of design, what Martin calls good design, I get this more or less linear curve. And yeah, I'm slower up until that inflection point. But then after I reach that inflection point, which I'm hoping all of our startups will reach that inflection point, you're moving faster. So I'm not saying sitting in big rooms, waterfall style, drawing, huge diagrams, getting, requirements documents that are like phone books. Just take a little bit of time up front and think about what you're doing. So I'm going to tell you a little story. So you're sitting in your office one day, your customer comes to you, be it consultant, your product manager from your company, says, I got 2 easy things for you to do, Zoo. I want you to take a CSV file, I want you to parse said CSV file, and then I want you to send me an email telling me how it all went. Maybe it's, sales reports, how much did we make this month, things like that. Easy peasy. So let's take a look at some of that code. So what we got here? Oh yeah, and I'm also using an editor, so all you Vim guys, don't start throwing tomatoes at me. So what do we got here? All right, so file processor 1. You sit down at your desk, you're like, awesome, I got to do 2 things. I'm going to take a file name, I'm going to parse the file, I'm going to report the status. Private methods, everybody's good to go. Hopefully you're writing tests about this stuff. There are no tests for this code, although I don't think I need it. Woo! Flying by the seat of my pants. Awesome. Code runs. I parse the file, everything goes well, everybody's happy. That took me all of 6 weeks to write. Does anybody see any problems with this code? Good. It's perfectly solid code. I would write that tomorrow. I did write this yesterday. All right, so that's cool. So we're good there. Awesome. Everybody's happy. You get kudos. You get a big backslap from the product manager. Everybody goes away. He comes back next week. He's like, all right, dude. So one of our affiliates is sending us tab-separated files. I didn't know what TSV meant up until 6 months ago. I was like, what is that? So tab-separated files. You're like, sweet, I can do that. No problem. You're still reporting via email, so not a big deal. And you write this code. How many people would write this code? Liars! Okay, I have another file. You guys probably write that code. So we come in, we branch on the name of the file. Depending on what type of file we're parsing, we delegate to some private methods. We report the status. If we can't find the file, if we don't know how to do that with the file type, we raise an exception. So how many people agree? Still good code? Yeah, yeah, good enough. But it's getting a little bit, you're kind of sitting there going, okay, this is good for now. I have to have this done in an hour. Whatever. I write the code, it's good to go. I write some tests. So my test suite starts to get a little bigger around this stuff because now I've got if statements and whatnot. So I'm getting a little bit bigger here. All right, so you're like, I'm going to get rid of the if statements. I'm going to move them out of the main body, and I'm going to put them in a private method. All right, sweet. So I take the file state, I take those down there. How many people would write this code? Oh, come on. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So, not a big deal. I'm like, still a little stinky. It's kind of like I got these if statements. It's a little harder to test. So what am I going to do? I'm going to get all crazy. And I'm going to use a factory pattern. You know, those Java guys, you guys have read the patterns book. Everybody read the patterns book. How many people have not read the patterns book? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this up a little bit. So I'm going to take that big nasty if statement out of my whole thing. I'm going to give somebody else responsibility for parsing my files. So as a file processor, my sole job now is to orchestrate the communication between lower level functionality. So I'm going to delegate to the file parser. I'm going to get this parser thing back that knows how to parse my file. I don't care what type that is because it's Ruby, it's duck typing, and it responds to parse. And then I'm going to get the status. I'm going to report the status. I eliminate all of my parsing functionality down here. I create this class here. So I've got two classes that know how to parse my different types of files. And I have a find method, which after talking to Mike Jackson last night, I got rid of the if statements for him. So I no longer have if statements anymore. So I have this whole Ruby metaprogramming nonsense where I just instantiate one of these things, I pass it back. I did it this morning when I got up. And I did just this the other day in some production code. So I've now removed one piece of one responsibility for functionality from my original class. It no longer knows how to parse files. And to prove to you that this all works, to be, yeehaw. So I'm getting the exception because I don't know how to parse the extra file that I'm giving it. So, how many people write that code? What code would you write?
You don't want to know.
That's awesome. My talk has now been validated. So yeah, I mean, it's a little more. There's a little more going on here. There's some classes. I've got a factory pattern, which is no longer got any if statements in it. So there's a little bit more going on. So what have I done here? So what's the difference? I said file processing is no longer responsible for the parsing of the files. I've delegated that to somebody else. What do I have to do to add a new file type? I make one new class that understands how to parse files. HTML, the ever-dreaded violence of XML, if we're going to go down that route, without changing anything else. It just magically works. This is the big thing for me. So I didn't write any tests for this, but I can now test my parsing and isolation. So I have a test suite for my processor that does, asserts a bunch of things. And I also have a test suite for my parsers that do things. If I change the parsers, all I do is run the parser test suite. If I change the processor, I can run the processor test suite. So it's the whole fast test thing. All right, awesome. So how many people are good with that? Yes, sir. Oh, you're good with that? Okay, cool. If you have questions, I'm kind of flying through this talk. I talk a little fast when I get nervous. If you have any questions, let me know. Let's definitely answer them now. We can talk about them afterwards. We can talk about them after drinking, beers later. That's always fun. Talking design after beers. So now my person, whoever is giving me direction, comes to me and says, all right, now I need SMS. Can everybody see where I'm going with this? Everybody following along? All right, sweet. So what do I need to do? We're going to assume that you did not see the light in the first refactoring because you didn't know about it. So I'm going to pass in a reporting method. I have another ever-dreaded if statement in there. And I'm just going to report status. So you can kind of see this file processor kind of moving towards the fat Rails models that we're all familiar with slowly. And that's the key, is this stuff moves slowly. Like bad code does not come out of somebody's head as bad code. Like 100-line models do not come out as 100-line models. Sometimes they do. Most of the time they don't. It happens over time. So it's this whole change thing. I was sitting at my desk the other day and looked at a model that was a couple lines, 100 lines of code, pretty big one. And I really had to tell myself that the person that wrote this, all the git blames, they didn't do this maliciously. This was not like, oh, Mike's going to be in here someday and let's drive him crazy. I'm already losing my hair. I don't need any more of that. They didn't do that. This stuff morphs over time. Developers leave, junior developers come in. This stuff, it just changes. It moves like the glaciers. So this thing gets, it got ugly over time. It's 3 weeks, and now it's kind of ugly. So what I'm going to propose is, why not take the time to do one more refactoring? So I'm going to pass in the reporter. So the file processor has no idea how it's reporting status to anybody. It just knows it is going to be given an object that is responsible for doing that. So if it's in Java, you're like, oh, dependency injection. Oh, no, it's Java patterns. But it's cool. Like, we have this ability to do this. I think Tony was talking about passing in the TCP/IP sockets. Why not hand these objects lower level things that do the work for them? And look how it cleans up the code. So I have my file parsers. That's nothing new. I now have 2 new classes that are responsible for my reporting. They have different initializers. So they have different constructors because they do different work. And the reporter knows no different. I can send it via email. I can send it via SMS. I can send it via carrier pigeon if you're kind of down with that. If it doesn't have to be there overnight. So we're moving in this direction of just taking a little bit of time, looking at code and being like, oh man, it's getting a little stinky in here. What do I need to do to remove a little bit of that stink? A little Lysol on the code every once in a while, not such a bad idea. So just to prove to you that I'm not lying to you and this stuff does actually work. So it's cool. Like, this stuff is just, we're moving this code, we're evolving this code along a path. So at some point when someone needs to change it, they don't have to have a whole lot of context. There's these distinct sections of the code that they can put in their heads, and they can reason about in small chunks. So how many people understand the whole domain of their application? That's what I thought. So we remove that mental overhead from developers. I like, because I have Buddhist symbols tattoos on the inside of my forearms and I practice yoga, I like meditation. I like focus. I like to focus on one thing and do that thing really, really well, and then move and focus on something else. With the original design, or if I'd kept evolving these classes along the path, the trajectory they had started along, I would have to know about processing, emailing, all this other stuff. So now these classes do one thing. Reporters are functionally interchangeable and reusable. So like Tony said, we have these constructs that we understand that we can use. Why not hand them to different things? So in this case, I'm passing them to a file processor. But what if I have another system another part of my system that needs email reporting or SMS reporting? I can hand that thing the exact same class that I'm using here. And it all just works. I don't have to retest that stuff. Nothing breaks. The contracts between the file reporter and these lower level supporting objects are small. One method and an initializer. I don't have to keep these huge contexts in my head. They do one thing for me. Again, because I'm a testing freak, it all can be done in isolation. So I have a test suite for my reporters, I have a test suite for my processors, I have a test suite that is now just simply a set of mocks and stubs for my reporter. It's simply orchestrating stuff. So when your product manager comes to you later and says, okay, now we need to download some files, we're going to parse PFDs or PDFs. I have no idea what a PFD file is. Or we need to report alerts via Nagios. Oop, I just got kicked off the Wi-Fi. Easy. You're like, all right, sweet, I know exactly what I have to do. I need another reporter. It's going to take me a week to write that reporter. All the tests pass, we're good to go. So back in the day, someone thought about this. So Bob Martin, I don't know exactly, does anybody know exactly when this was written? I forget exactly when it was written. It was like late 90s, I think, early 2000s. He thought about all this. He's like, okay, we have these things called design principles. We have these things called design patterns. Let's use them to write good software. So the first one, single responsibility principle. I am a huge fan of this one. This is the principle that I use whenever looking at a piece of code. If you have to take one principle out of here, this is the one I would ask you to take with you. Everything does one thing. Our models do not have 200 lines of code. They are no longer obese, and they can move under their own weight, and it doesn't take forever to change them. The single responsibility in Fowler's paper is defined as every object has one reason to change and one reason only. So if you go back to our latest example, what is the one reason to change for the file processor? I add another step. I add the downloading step. Nobody else cares about that. The processors, they have one reason to change. Either I add a new piece of functionality, a new file to parse, or I change the way I'm parsing files. Maybe I have a new library that parses CSV files faster. I'm going to change one thing, and nobody else cares about that stuff. This is another favorite one of mine, which is interesting. Again, these are principles, so there's no hard and fast rules for using these things. Open for extension, closed to modification. So how is my file processor class open for extension but closed for modification? So it's open for extension because I can add a new parser or I can add a new reporter without changing a line of code in the processor. And that's what closed to modification is. I don't have to change that code. That code just magically works if I add a new file type. Liskov substitution, I will save you the details. If you want to read about exactly what this is, go ahead. There's a great article on Wikipedia. Liskov substitution says that I can exchange pieces of functionality as long as they have the same interface and provide me the same piece of work. So if I have one class that has a deliver method that doesn't return anything, and I have another class that has a deliver method that doesn't return anything, they are substitutable because there's nothing coming out and the same stuff goes in. Liskov, if you violate Liskov, you get an object that changes things. And it's kind of hard to explain, but go read about it. It's actually a really interesting principle and a very misunderstood principle as well. Interface segregation, you're going to raise your hand and say, hey, Mike, we don't have interfaces in Ruby. I understand that. People try to implement them. Not such a good idea. The spirit of this one for me in Ruby is that whole idea of small objects. So if I make my classes naturally single responsibility, I'm going to limit the interfaces. This is pretty much, hey, if I limit the number of methods that my class has, it's going to be easier to rationalize about it. There's not this big context I have to keep in my head. And then we have this idea of dependency inversion. So a little bit different than dependency injection. They are subtly different. One is a pattern, one is a principle. This is a principle, injection is a pattern. This principle states that I have higher level constructs in my system that rely on abstractions of lower level concepts. So the email reporter is a perfect example of dependency inversion. I have no idea what kind of reporter I'm getting. I just know that I have this notion of a reporter in my system, and I know how to interact with that notion. So again, your mileage is going to vary on these. There was an interesting article, when was it? I read a couple of weeks ago about dueling design patterns. So sometimes these things conflict, and you're going to get into that. It's going to happen because these are high-level constructs, but if you at least make an effort to apply some sort of design pattern to your system, your life is going to be much, much easier. So a bunch of images from Flickr, some awesome talks. So this one is one of my favorites. This was given by Sandy Metz, and a good talk. Jim Wyrick gives this talk, another good one. There's a link to the original paper. Ruby best practices, things like that. So I want to thank you all for listening. It's been kind of an intense morning. I think, as Gary stated, we're kind of at a point in Ruby and Rails where it's time to put in the hard work. We can continue to just jam things into our models. Doesn't mean we should, just because we can. So there's a speaker right up there. I would very much appreciate feedback on this talk. I think it's important. I would love to continue to give this talk to other groups of people to educate us all as to how we can kind of make our lives a lot easier when using Ruby, because I love writing Ruby. I'm actually, my Scala question was because I'm learning Scala too. It's an interesting language, but I love Ruby. So I want to make sure that we continue to move along that curve that Gary talked about, where we expand and we contract, and we keep bumping that curve up the chain. But the only way we're going to do that is to start talking about this stuff and figuring it out and doing the hard work and teaching people that kind of spidey sense thing. So question in the back. Oh, sorry. Yeah, it's for some reason the slides are getting cut off. I'll slide that up so people can read it.
Using PowerPoint?
It's a work laptop, man. I tried to use one of the JavaScript ones, and when I gave the talk the first time, it cut off like the sides because the display port was different. So yeah. So there's my GitHub. Would love to talk to people about this. I love talking about this stuff. I love doing this stuff. So at the Hackfest, if you've got some like Rails models where you want some feedback, more than happy to sit down and talk about this. I learn new stuff every time I do this. This is one of the reasons I love legacy code bases. I know it's kind of crazy, but it gives me the opportunity to experience this stuff firsthand, because the only way to get good at this stuff is to do it. So I think I have a couple of minutes. Do you have any questions about this stuff? I think we've gone through a couple of talks and it's getting kind of late.
As you apply these patterns to your code, do you apply the same patterns to your tests?
I try to. I mean, tests are just code. So I don't know. I mean, I tend to be very verbose with my tests. I'd rather have tests that are very verbose than try to get really fancy with them, and sometimes they need pruning. But for me, the code is important. I can, the test suite, if it runs a little slow, I can, bump it up on a better computer. But my big principle is I always take the time to be like, there's some pain here. There's some friction. Do I need to address this now, or can I wait? And if I do address it, I use that. I'm like, oh, there's something here. But I acknowledge the friction, and I either make a decision to address it or not address it. So many people don't even, because they don't see the friction, or they don't feel it, and they just walk right on by, and it's like, oh, this hurts when I hit myself on the side of the head. Well, stop hitting yourself on the side of the head. So yeah, it's kind of a fuzzy topic. That's why I love talking about this stuff, because it's fuzzy.
Are there reasonable exceptions to decoupling everything and making every class do just one thing? Would you tolerate any of these?
Would I tolerate them? If I made a conscious decision not to, then that is a good reason. Again, these are principles, so it's just things I keep in the back of my head, but it depends on what mood I'm in with my developers. So we do GitHub-style pull requests, and sometimes we're under the gun, we got to get this stuff done. I had a developer who put a bunch of code in controller one day, and he's like, I want to refactor this, but I don't have the time. I'm like, okay, you're going to put it in a ticket to refactor that. 2 weeks later, he refactored it, and we pushed it to production. So it depends. But I always at least ask the question of developers, does this need to be refactored? Is this the right quote-unquote way to do this? I think I'm out of time, but again, more than happy to talk about this with other people. 2 more questions. All right, right down here.
So how do you balance upfront design versus just getting things done? Because at the beginning of a project, you'll see, there are 30 things that might happen, and only 3 of them end up happening in actuality. So there's this sort of tension.
Sure. So you'll notice that the first code I wrote I didn't break out those classes. As soon as I added that second parser, that was enough friction for me to be, okay, this is going to have to go somewhere. Sometimes I go to 3, just to assure myself that the path I think the code is taking is the path the code will actually take. And that path might change, but I'm already down that path 3 data points. So again, I don't like upfront stuff. Sometimes I will if I know, like if I'm doing 2 iterations and I know the second iteration is coming that is not going to change, I might do that in the first one, but I really fight that urge. Again, if I have a good test suite, then it's whatever. I'm just moving tests around between test suites, which I did the other day too, where I refactored a bunch of code. I just literally lock, stock, and barrel moved tests, changed some of the variable names, and away we went, and we had better code. One more. All right, sweet. Thank you all very much.